Fascism, a word that's made an alarming resurgence in recent times. Day by day, we witness the sacred pillars of democracy slowly crumble and fall, chipped away by reactionary forces, soon to be reduced to nothing but ash. All across the world, we face social unrest and political uncertainty as our future and very livelihoods are called into question. We are plagued by growing disillusion with the political system, as many lack confidence in both the government and liberal democracy. Voter participation is ever declining as election integrity is being called into question, degrading the very concept of free and fair elections. Negligence, corruption, and intrigue have run amok as geriatric politicians tasked with steering the nation towards stability have seemingly fallen asleep at the wheel as we drift ever closer towards an ominous iceberg. Many of us see the threat and rush for the expected lifeboats, desperate to survive the impending collision, only to find our very vessel was not equipped from the start as we fall victim to our own hubris and drown in the waters below. History is a wheel, for the nature of man is fundamentally unchanging. What has happened before will perforce happen again. Marginalized communities find themselves the target of a vicious witch hunt, resembling that of the 1920s and 30s, noted by the rise of xenophobic, racist, homophobic, and transphobic threats, which at times lead to shocking bouts of violence. These acts are being bolstered by both politicians and reactionary talking heads that hold the aim of influencing the general public through a series of targeted propaganda campaigns and online conspiracy theories. Inequality is at an all-time high as the economy is in ever decline, as the masses fight each other instead of working together towards class solidarity. While those at the very top, the ultra-wealthy, are becoming richer than even monarchs of old, using their capital to subvert democracy and sway morally questionable politicians to do their bidding in an effort to maintain their own power and uphold the status quo. Meanwhile, the average worker, tax-paying citizens and families struggle ever more to stay afloat, unable to benefit from the fruits of their hard labor in a constant fight against homelessness, poverty, inflation, and despair. With the dream of equality and a better tomorrow, many have chosen to organize and take to the streets in a collaborative effort to steer the nation away from its impending doom. Yet in a tale as old as time, neither side, left nor right, can decide on which direction to turn, finding ourselves again in a desperate match of tug-of-war for the heart of the nation, mired with mythology and malice. Fascism is an ideology that was once thought to be resigned to history, but now finds itself being reborn and rising like a phoenix from the ashes of a failing democracy. But what is fascism and what makes a fascist? What are the conditions, both economically and socially, that allowed for this ideology to take hold? And finally, how did their parties rise to power before either radicalizing or fizzling out like a squib? By the end of this series, this is what we hope to understand. We will start by observing the rocky transition from feudalism to the capitalist modernity, the period that laid the soil for the ideology to take root and later manifest, before moving to the conditions that created fascism, then later how these parties rose to power, exercised their newfound power, and finally how they failed. And throughout the series, we will also analyze fascist themes in media, such as books, movie, TV shows, video games, and even anime. That's right, weebs, I am coming for you too. On the topic of fascism, both in documentaries, on the news, and in casual discussion, the conversation tends to surround the men at the helm of these parties and their subsequent goon squads, and less on the conditions that surrounded the rise of the movements, almost altogether ignoring the authentic mass popular enthusiasm, seemingly inevitable due to the societal conditioning and crises of the 18th to 20th century. Fascism wasn't forced upon the public by dictators and their cronies. People were asking for a savior from the failures of a democracy in crisis, and it was only then that these parties were able to take hold behind a charismatic leader, a Caesar. All the same, this ideology neither started with Mussolini nor ended with Hitler, and is just as much a threat today than ever before. This time with an even higher chance of succeeding if we remain blind to the warning signs and ignore the lessons from history. And spoiler alert, the conditions are tragically copy and paste. Fascism is, at its core, a violent reaction to both the economic and societal changes of the modern world under capitalism. So I thought, instead of jumping straight into the 1930s or spend hours going over the philosophy of Hegel and Sorel, we would analyze the ideology from a different angle, first observing the stormy transition from feudalism to capitalism before breaking down new political ideologies and imperial wars that allowed for fascism to take root. So as we're all able to travel again, I thought we'd get out of here and go on a little vacation, or holiday, as they say in the UK. And for those of you, like myself, who do not like to touch grass, or for those of you special snowflakes who don't want to be trapped for hours in a metal tube full of demons, worry not, as we are going on a cruise instead. And it's from time to time, I do like to travel in style. I have booked us all tickets, first class on the most luxurious of steam engines, a true wonder of modernity where absolutely nothing tragic is expected to happen. Welcome to the SS Titanic. I'll be our captain for the journey. It's 21 Celsius or 70 Fahrenheit, a light breeze, projected to be smooth sailing into modernity.
In antiquity, slaves were, in all honesty, called slaves. In the Middle Ages, they took the name of serfs. Nowadays, they are called wage earners.
Feudalism was the dominant social structure of medieval Europe from approximately the 9th to 15th century. This was a relatively simple system where the ruling lord owned most of the land and, by extension, the means of production. The peasants, or serfs, in turn farmed the land and paid varying degrees of taxes or tributes alongside their best harvest in exchange for military protection. Serfdom developed in Europe between the 5th to 7th centuries in response to the breakdown of the slave system on which the economy of Imperial Rome had been built. Although not an ideal system, serfdom was preferable to being a slave under Rome, and having access to land not only increased the serfs' general autonomy, but gave them a degree of bargaining rights with their feudal lord. All the same, the serfs were bonded to the landlords, their possessions were their master's property, and their lives were ruled in every respect by the law of the manor. The church also owned a large swath of land, which granted them immeasurable amounts of wealth. They were accepted as both the religious and moral authority overall, including the nobility, who also doubled as tenants. The church also collected tithes, the equivalent of tributes from the serfs, in exchange for protection of their soul into the afterlife. The monarchy and the church represented the two pillars that held up feudal society, often working together in tandem to keep the peasants in line. Hierarchy remained constant, with the king and clergy always at the very top, followed by the feudal lords, then the knights and vassals, then the merchants, farmers, and craftsmen, and then at the very bottom, the serfs. This was how society was structured in Europe for hundreds of years, despite constant social and class struggle between the working classes and the feudal lords. Life for the peasantry wasn't without its difficulties, as farm life or domestic servitude was still hard labor, but both men and women, for all things considered, shared the bulk of the workload. Despite being considered second class to men, women also worked in the fields in addition to raising their children, cooking, washing, spinning, keeping an herb garden, and shared domestic labor with their family. The amount of hours people worked were also shorter and allowed for more bonding time with friends and family, full of local festivities that, depending on the time, had bountiful harvests. Families were larger due to necessity of needing extra hands on the farm, but it was neither desirable nor preferable to have many children, as most children didn't survive adulthood due to disease, famine, and a lack of modern medicine. War was seen as a necessary evil, usually due to feudal interest or religious conflict, and depending on the time period and location, you might not have ever seen a real war. It was often with great difficulty that the nobles would raise a peasant army, and many of those soldiers deserted the battle after pocketing their pay. No longer was it a time of Roman legionaries and Spartan warriors. Sure, there were knights, but even this position wasn't necessarily considered to be honorable until the installation of the chivalric code by the 12th century. Even then, many knights who didn't wish to engage in combat could simply buy their way out of war, a usually simple enough task as many came from noble backgrounds to begin with. Industry of varying degrees existed for a long time, but for the most part production was controlled by private guild networks as opposed to the invisible hand of the free market. This kept access to the general economy amongst a select few who in time were able to grow their personal wealth. All the same, class struggle was consistent even under feudalism, with constant peasant rebellions that usually ended in either violence or death, so it was inevitable that one day the tides would turn along with the changes of the modern era.
Capitalism was a response to the feudal lords, the patrician merchants, the bishops, and the popes to a centuries-long social conflict that, in the end, shook their power and truly gave all the world a big jolt. Capitalism was the counter-revolution that destroyed the possibilities that had emerged from the anti-feudal struggle.
In 1760, as the Industrial Revolution sprung out of England, too came an even greater division of class, as the guilds were replaced by industrialists and bankers, while tradesmen drifted not too far behind. The Industrial Revolution began with England keeping a firm grasp on the steering wheel, driving their nation head-on towards destiny. Due to their vast colonies and trading partners, the British Empire had become incomprehensibly wealthy, supported by their vast naval fleets of steam engines, expansive network of railroads, and large arsenal of modern weaponry, which initially gave them the upper hand over rival nations. Both the aristocratic nobility and quickly rising bourgeoisie would import raw material such as gold, silver, metals, diamond, cotton, meat, grain, timber, and tea, which would allow for England to produce goods for sale and export. A highly profitable system for a time, but England's lead couldn't last forever, as other nations would eventually follow suit. All the same, by the 1800s, the British Empire spanned 35 million square kilometers, or approximately a fourth of the globe, which gave them plenty of room for bragging rights on the imperial scale. Despite industrial growth making the upper classes fabulously wealthy, the lower classes had little to show. Factory workers, for example, often worked long hours around highly dangerous equipment in exchange for menial wages. Millions of men, women, and children were severely injured or even died for a variety of reasons, ranging from exposure to hazardous chemicals to being maimed by a machine. Artisans, artists, and science-minded people were now reduced to mere laborers, cogs in an industrial machine that had lost their value in a society now driven by a profit motive. Imperialism and colonialism were at an all-time high as, naturally, both industry and manufacturing require resources which are then used to produce products to be sold at market. The nobility had the obvious advantage in this lucrative practice due to their established position at the top of the hierarchy as both landowners with heavily political sway. However, they weren't without competition, as the growing bourgeoisie had both market and trade interests of their own that came with several demands that couldn't be ignored, bolstered by growing coffers to rival that of the old regime. And as neither side could fully agree on the direction the ship should sail, revolution was imminent. Bourgeoisie, a class of citizens who were wealthier members of the Third Estate. In Marxist theory, the class that, in contrast to the proletariat or wage-earning class, is primarily concerned with property values, who own most of the wealth in a capitalist system. From the ashes of revolution allowed for the transition of power and private property from the king and the church to the bourgeoisie, who also function as the backbones and often paychecks of these revolutions. Once the dust settled, those who remained standing would take their seat at the table, so to speak, alongside the old ruling classes, making demands of their own, if not overthrowing them almost entirely like we saw in France. This allowed for the bourgeoisie to become essentially the new architects of the modern world, shaping society in their image in the place of what was once king and clergy under feudalism. Even though the term bourgeoisie was coined by Karl Marx, someone who might come up from time to time during the series, this concept technically emerged as early as the 11th century with the advent of medieval cities. Similar to modern times, medieval towns and cities functioned as centers of industrial, commercial, and social life that welcomed a network of international trade along with a vibrant social environment for its citizens to connect with their local communities. This provided the advent of city centers where merchants could also sell their products to obtain more wealth than a mere peasant, but significantly less than a lord, keeping them still relatively low on the pyramid until much later in time. After feudalism collapsed, and with it feudal lords, hierarchy and class struggles still remained, but took on a different light crafted in the image of new rulers with new global objectives. Unlike the kings and queens who followed God's divine will, the bourgeoisie followed only the money in a constant quest for economic growth. And this is where we will officially begin. Throughout this series, we're going to discuss, in varying capacities, several modern political ideologies or isms, most notably liberalism, socialism, conservatism, and capitalism, all of which were established by the mid-19th century. Fascism uniquely arose in the 20th century as a response to these ideologies and their perceived failures, right with ultra-nationalist sentiment. The one term that needs most of an early explanation is liberalism, so that's where I'll start today. Liberalism is a political ideology that arose during the Western Age of Enlightenment and predominantly focuses on the principles of individuality, the importance of self over that of a collective group, liberty or freedom, self-determination, a free market economy, and equality under the law with a transparent government where the rights of the average citizen were also represented. So for the context of these videos, whenever I refer to liberalism, I mean so in both the classical and social definitions of the 13th to 18th century and not the neoliberal rework that took place in the 1940s before rising to prominence under people like Milton Friedman, Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan in the 70s and 80s. Classical liberals believed in the protection of individual rights and private property paired with a laissez-faire economic system along with little to no government regulation of the market. Social liberals believe that all humans should have access to basic needs such as education, shelter, and social services, which they do consider to be human rights, but want to do so under a capitalist system as opposed to socialists who wish to abolish the practice entirely. Social liberals also believe the government should support their citizens at its most basic level through taxation. So again, For the context of this specific time period, anytime I mention the term liberal or liberalism, pre-1940s is what I'm referring to, and not the modern neoliberals of 1970s onwards for obvious reasons. All the same, fascists had a disdain for elements of both classical liberalism and, of course, social liberalism, so they're both worth clarifying. Nationalism is a doctrine invented in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. It is the idea that a state should represent and serve the interests of a people or nation that shares a common culture and history and feels united as one. The concept of nationalism in itself isn't inherently a bad thing, but those radicalized with nationalist sentiment will not only exaggerate the significance of their respective nation, but also believe in fulfilling a sort of historic destiny. This ultra-nationalist sentiment causes citizens to become blind to the faults of their nation in a very main character syndrome or hero-protagonist sort of effect. Nationalism was a useful element in the formation of both country and empire, along with being a driving force in the revolution itself. History isn't like Lord of the Rings, where one side is pure and conquers over the Dark Lord with no nuance in between. To an extreme, members of their respective nation might feel that any horrific action towards an outgroup is valid as long as the ends justify the means, as long as our team wins. On the global scale, this newfound sense of nationalism led to even more intense competition among both dominant and growing empires. So with a limited amount of territory on the planet to conquer, possessing a finite amount of resources, every leader was looking for a chance to secure their nation's place on the imperial stage. No one wanted to be last, having to contend with bigger whales that already possessed the wealth and military might to challenge anyone who dared contend with them. As a result, the consolidation of empires began, supported by technology invented in the modern era. Nationalism, in its conception, was an ideology that was given to us from the French, so that will be our first stop on this journey. Just a little note in advance, though, is you might want to stock up on some extra food because the cuisine in our next destination isn't as promising. Similar to the rest of early modern Europe, the majority of the lower classes were also unable to vote, as this was a privilege granted only to landowners, resulting in the lower classes facing little to no representation in politics. Many workers made demands for reform, but most of their demonstrations were broken up with violence, which at times also resulted in deaths. All the same, due to England's unprecedented success on the imperial scale, many citizens, most especially within the British Empire, believed themselves to be superior, resulting in nationalism at an all-time high. After all, they had the biggest empire, and in comparison to their European neighbors, England saw relative peace, with the exception of a few colonial wars that didn't last all too long. France industrialized in the 1830s, 70 years later than England, but eventually became dominant in textiles and furniture manufacturing. And by the 1870s, almost a quarter of French workers were employed in factories or heavy industry, a period coined La Belle Époque. Growth and industrialization also allowed for the construction of a rapid railroad network, which further promoted trade and aided in military campaigns, most notably useful to Napoleon during his invasion wars. France was determined to maintain control over continental Europe and increase military spending along with a nationalist sentiment. However, after facing defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, Russia and France feared the rising power and military might of Germany, which had allied with Austria-Hungary and Italy.
The secret of freedom lies in educating people, whereas the secret of tyranny is in keeping them ignorant.
Once the French Revolution began in 1789, all of Europe, including its elites, sat back and observed with both curiosity and anxiety. After all, these very French Enlightenment values of liberty, equality, and fraternity required fully dismantling the feudal bonds that held society together for nearly 2,000 years and replacing it with something supposedly more equal, more democratic. A transition to a new modern era where kings of old lost their thrones, the all-powerful church was given a major debuff, and mere lowly peasants for once had a say in the government of their country, and by extension gained more equal rights under the law. Before the revolution, class division was at an all-time high. The rich generally didn't associate with the poor, and the balance of power within the government was highly flawed, favoring the elites who made up the minority over the peasants who made up the majority. All the same, both peasants and nobles were affected by a poor agricultural economy due to a failing harvest, compiled with poor financial management. To solve this dilemma, the ruling elites wanted to modernize and add new technology to assist with farming, while the peasants wanted to cling on to old methods, putting the different social classes at ever-growing odds. It wasn't until the revolution that people from across class boundary unified together under a single cause. Alongside the revolution rose this new modern concept of nation, and by extension, nationalism. Ernest Gellner, the author of Nations and Nationalism, argues that industrial society has a need to equip workers with skills that cannot be provided by families and churches, the traditional educational institutions of an agrarian society. This gives rise to public systems of education that develop standardized idioms and shared culture, which in turn come to define a nation. He then stressed that industrial society strengthened the boundaries between nations rather than those between classes.
Imperialism is a system of exploitation that occurs not only in the brutal form of those who come with guns to conquer territory. Imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: a loan, food aid, blackmail. We are fighting this system that allows a handful of men on Earth to rule all of humanity.
The German Empire, or Second Reich, formed in 1871 and caused tension most especially amongst the British ruling classes. They feared that a strong sense of German nationalism would encourage their own imperial ambitions, eventually putting the two ever-growing powers at odds, which was bad for England because Germany was known to have a strong military. After all, with only so much conquerable land in the world, conflict was inevitable as nations rose and fell. No longer a complicated mix of semi-autonomous kingdoms, dukedoms, free cities, and principalities. Under the Holy Roman Empire, a unified Germany also brought about a boom in industry and technology, which coincided with the quickly increasing population. By the 1900s, German steel production even surpassed Britain, allowing them to trail closely behind the United States. Despite calls for social reform, militarism, nationalism, and absolute crown authority remained. Unlike their Western counterparts in France, England, and the United States that had embraced Enlightenment ideals, Germany went in a different direction. Amongst the ruling and intellectual classes in Germany, the opinions of the French was poor due to the Napoleonic invasion and liberation wars where Germany saw its land and art pillaged by French soldiers. All the same, the desire for political unification and cultural self-determination increased, but their sentiments towards a liberal democracy and the values of the French Enlightenment had soured. Instead, the Germans chose to venerate German art and literature over liberalism, giving them near autocratic rule over their citizens. After Germany achieved their coveted empire, Kaiser Wilhelm and his Chancellor Otto von Bismarck focused predominantly on straightening the ties within the continent, aware of imperial rivals on all sides. However, with the crowning of a more ambitious Wilhelm II who wanted to shine on the imperial stage, competing with his cousins in England and Russia, foreign policy changed. Wilhelm II had his sights on places such as Asia and the Pacific, along with the Balkans and Eastern Europe, potentially stirring conflict with the weakening Ottoman Empire. and after victory in the Franco-Prussian War, they were feeling pretty good about their military capabilities with an economy to rival that of the United States. By the 20th century, Tsarist Russia was a sort of mystery to a lot of the Western world. It appeared to be a dominant imperial force in the modern era, while still maintaining a nearly medieval level of technological development. And unlike most of their European counterparts, Russia was still led by an absolute monarchy that by the 20th century was rumored to be secretly influenced by a creepy sex mystic who was also rumored to be an immortal. Under an absolute monarchy, the Tsar had autocratic power, beholden to neither parliament nor people, but only God himself. And similar to their European neighbors Germany and Italy, the Russians didn't take too kindly to the French liberal revolutionary values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, most likely preferring that their peasants didn't take up arms against their superiors. Therefore, the Russian Empire, too, went in an almost completely different direction. Instead, the Russian Tsars maintained autocratic rule over a heavily subjugated peasant class through brutal methods, including domestic military intervention. And although many amongst the ruling classes feared the violence perpetuated during the French Revolution, ironically, Tsar Nicholas II arguably killed more of his own people, an estimated 900,000 to 1.5 million under his rule alone, in a concerted effort to hold on the tradition. In contrast, the Jacobins unalived an estimated 40,000 people during the French Revolution. Additionally, being slow to industrialize created a new slew of problems, especially between the poor working classes, many of them serfs, until 1861 when the practice was abolished by legal decree. Nearly 75% of Russia's population were farmers that still clung to old traditions and ways of living, slow to adapt and resistant to change. While the Industrial Revolution had a profound impact on growing nations like Britain, France, and Germany, Russia's economy remained almost entirely agrarian until the mid-1800s. Russia also possessed an exceptionally large territory, nearly 1/6 of the world's landmass, rich with natural resources such as iron, coal, and steel, supported by a population of nearly 128 million by 1900. Russia also had the largest standing military of around 1.5 million soldiers, made up mostly of serfs that Tsar Nicholas claimed to be protected by God, along with his very throne, which he believed to be his divine right. It was likely for this reason, along with other imperial ambitions, that the Tsar made the call to invade the Turkish Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia and modern Romania in 1852 to defend these Christian minorities. And fearful of Russia gaining too much territory, Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia formed an alliance with the intention of fighting back the Russian aggression. Unfortunately for the Tsar, the Orthodox version of God was busy and only the Protestant, Catholic, and Islamic God Allah came to play, resulting in a Russian defeat that weakened not only their blessed army, but also their treasury, faith in the people, and influence across all of Europe. The Ottoman Empire for much of the medieval era was considered to be the powerhouse of Europe and possessed one of the world's largest imperial powers. The empire was unrivaled in its lucrative trade routes, impressive architecture, and elaborate mosques that helped define culture, bolstered by notable achievements in mathematics and astronomy. The Ottoman Empire was founded by Osman I, a leader of the Turkish tribes in Anatolia in 1299, where both the empire and general term Ottoman got their name. Over the next 150 years, the Ottoman Empire continued to expand westward, eventually putting themselves in contact with the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire. In 1453, Mehmed II the Conqueror led the Ottoman Turks in capturing the ancient city of Constantinople, the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, using a combination of super cannon and blessing of a blood moon. Then, Sultan Mehmed II also renamed the city Istanbul and made it the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. However, even to this day, some more salty Christians still call Istanbul by its former name. The Ottoman Empire reached its peak between 1520 and 1566 during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, and at the height of the empire, they possessed Bulgaria, Egypt, Greece, Hungary, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Macedonia, Romania, Syria, parts of Arabia, and North Africa. Large empires are also very difficult to maintain, and as the years passed, the Ottoman Empire slowly began to crumble. And by the 1600s, they began to saw a decline in both their economic and military dominance over Europe. This was due to several factors, including competition between imperial rivals bolstered by the Industrial Revolution, corruption, a lack of expansion, and simply being too late to reform and modernize. Over the next 100 years, the empire began to lose key regions of land. After a revolt, Greece won its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1830s. In 1878, the Congress of Berlin declared the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Bulgaria. And by the 1850s, the situation was so dire that Tsar Nicholas I of Russia famously declared the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, which, I don't know, seemed kind of bold of Russia at the time, but I digress. All, however, wasn't entirely lost, as the Ottoman Empire still had a chance to hold on if they made the right alliances moving forward into the 20th century. The Spanish-American War of 1898 started due to America's pursuit of manifest destiny, a belief that American settlers had a right to expand their territory across all of North America, combined with Spain's long-declining imperial power in Latin America and in Cuba. This conflict resulted in a win for the Americans, granting them the territories of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, most of South America, and Cuba for a time. The United States also had time to complete a side quest and annex the once independent state of Hawaii. This enabled the United States to establish its predominance in the Caribbean region while also allowing them to pursue its strategic and economic interests in Asia, solidifying U.S. imperial interests. This also resulted in the end of both the Spanish Empire and their colonial rule in the Americas, which essentially also meant that they were sitting out the next two major wars. And when you think about it in hindsight, it was likely for the best, considering what was to come. What all these growing nations had in common was an increase in militarism, imperialism, and nationalist fervor. This was only bolstered by new forms of technology that enabled effective propaganda, useful for manufacturing consent in order to keep the population complicit as competition came to a head.
What gunpowder did for war, the printing press has done for the mind.
For example, version 1 of a movable printing press was created around the 1400s by Johannes Gutenberg, who at the time was employed as a goldsmith. This invention, predominantly made of wood, was only able to print on one side of a very large sheet of paper and would frequently break down over prolonged use. It wasn't until the 1800s, some 400 years later, that the printing press was given an update. Now made completely from iron with the capacity to create 100 issues within an hour on a more reasonably sized double-sided paper. So, with the ability to print at a much faster rate, naturally, more books from aspiring authors were produced, facilitating an interest in literature amongst the lower classes. Language, as a result, also became more standardized than what we see today. Newspapers, the earliest form of mass media, were able to deliver information on a broader scale than ever before, giving people a more conscious awareness of citizens within their respective nation. Technology often acts like a double-edged blade. The invention of the printing press did not come without its share of problems as it shaped modern society. Not only did discussions of censorship come back into light, but also freedom of press, as those who controlled the media also influenced the minds of the general population. Similar to today, the media played an instrumental role in not only influencing the trends of society and promoting advertisements, but also to manufacture consent and sway public opinion. So let's say you want to get the population in on support of an invasion war, which required an increase in military spending, then using the media is the best way to do this. The tactics used back then were also not too far off from today, as rival nations were also demonized in the media to nearly cartoon villain levels of evil, stoking fear in the readers that the nation was being threatened by an elusive other plotting their imminent downfall. Media heavily shaped people's perception of the other, often portraying rival nations in very negative cliches and eluding the evil intent, stoking fear in the average citizen just trying to go about their daily lives. Leaders of respective nations were especially targeted in the media, portrayed as madmen hell-bent on world domination, someone we must defend ourselves against, of course, with increased military spending. Of course, to ease the fears of a foreign invasion or threat to trade interests came the rise of militarism, a system where the military is exalted and its needs and considerations are given top priority. This resulted in the beginning of a never-ending modern arms race, as militaries began to reform and purchase new weapons in a quest for global dominance. Opportunistically, inventors and salesmen, the representatives of the bourgeoisie, were itching to become wealthy from all the shiny new murder weapons gifted by the modern era, and their buyers, fueled with nationalist sentiment, had endless pockets. The strongest nation is typically equated with the strongest military and the most stable economy, essentially undermining the necessity for diplomacy when something goes awry. Nothing lasts forever, as, historically speaking, all empires rise and then eventually fall, quite similar to how capitalist economies systematically tend to both boom and bust, creating fertile ground for social discord.
We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields.
World War I, or the Great War, was at its core the product of imperialism, militarism, and nationalism facing off and exploding into fiery brilliance. What was left in its path were its conditions, both socioeconomically and politically, for fascism to arise, by taking these virtues learned from the 17th to 20th centuries to a near terminal extreme. So, everyone famously knows that the beginning of World War I ultimately started by the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie of Austria in the capital city of Sarajevo of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The culprits were a group of 6 Bosnian assassins aided by the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group whose aim was to free Bosnia and Herzegovina from Austrian-Hungarian rule. This was a huge deal because the Archduke was not only the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph I, but was also the heir to the dual monarchy, so his death naturally caused a widespread shock throughout all of Europe. The royal family was also humiliated due to the manner in which he was executed, by assumed terrorists, a rebel group who was rumored to be tied to the government themselves. To make matters even worse, the Serbian government also rejected Austrian inquiry into the details of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's deaths. This gesture prompted further suspicion that the government itself may have been running a conspiracy. This was later found to be untrue, but the damage had already been done. Even though all key members involved in the assassination were tried and punished for their crimes, war was on the horizon. The assassination of the Archduke was a huge blow to the royal family and to a weakness within the monarchy and, by extension, the empire. Conveniently, it also gave much of the ruling class an excuse to finally declare war, as many were anticipating a major event to happen within continental Europe for some time now. So peace was long overdue and war was inevitable. This was also the last major war led by monarchs, as King George V of England, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany were all first cousins and grandchildren of the late Queen Victoria, who died 13 years prior. And due to the complicated alliance system that was set in place at the time, Europe was essentially divided into 2 halves, and everyone had an obligation to enter the war. The Triple Entente was made up of Britain, France, and yes, Russia, while Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy made up the Triple Alliance, creating the foundation for the Central Powers. So with the stage set and alliances drawn, Europe kicked off a continental war that no one realized they never wanted.
At the end of the war, Europeans were torn between an old world that could not be revived and a new world about which they disagreed bitterly. As war economies were dismantled too quickly, wartime inflation spun out of control, making a mockery of the bourgeois virtues of thrift and savings. A population that had come to expect public solutions to economic problems was thrown into uncertainty.
For 4 years, Europe was devastated by the unprecedented horrors of industrial modern warfare. Many soldiers, for the first time, experienced the destructive capabilities of menacing tanks, soaring jets, automatic machine guns, artillery shells, flamethrowers, landmines, and new forms of chemical warfare that would push the human spirit to its absolute limits. Not everyone is prepared for the horrors of modern warfare. Not too unsurprising, as for years prior, many had a romanticized idea of war, but never quite experienced it for themselves. Due to the varying degree of military technology between rival nations, many armies came unprepared as a result, and those who were late to modernize saw devastating effects. Both conscripts and volunteers, new friends and brothers in arms, found themselves fighting for the glory and honor of their respective nations, upholding alliances forged in the blood of their citizens, most of whom, only a few weeks later, would lay dead in the mud as hot steel ripped through their bodies after essentially living in a strategically dug trench was acted as both cover and temporary grave. Those even less fortunate above ground might take the wrong step and encounter a landmine, causing the ground to explode beneath them, blowing off an arm or a leg, or worse, leaving you dying a painful death as your body was filled with shrapnel. Chemical warfare was also not off the table, as mustard gas, introduced by the Germans, was engineered to blister the eyes, skin, and lungs, resulting in, at the very least, internal damage and, at the worst, death. Gas was also an unpredictable form of warfare, with the unintended consequence of gassing your own troops simply due to a bad breeze, something that very much did happen to the Germans during the war. You see, friendly fire is a constant and, reality, and several of these new weapons, including chemical weapons, were being tested for the first time, and many did not quite know what to expect. Those that survived the horrors of war returned to another, even more menacing battle on the home front, one within their minds. Traumatic nightmares, blurred vision, fatigue, headaches, debilitating stress, and dissociation became more common among the war veterans. A new term was even created for this particular phenomenon, shell shock, and it was commonly misunderstood. Unfortunately, there wasn't psychological help available to treat this condition, and many soldiers who returned from the war faced unemployment, so more self-destructive habits such as extreme drinking or violence became more prevalent. Really anything to numb the pain and constant struggle in an effort to return to civilian life. So they suffer behind a mask, often with little prospect for the future, and little to show for their efforts in war, and unfortunately, many took their own lives. This was a stark contrast to the romanticized wartime propaganda and invasion literature that was being pushed in the media, and by extension onto the general public, in a concerted effort to manufacture consent to fund the growing arms race. No one could truly anticipate the brutality of trench warfare and the high casualty rate of 20 million dead and over 20 million injured that ensued. All the same, many soldiers, most notably that of Adolf Hitler, a man who will appear later in the series for obvious reasons, passionately fought in the name of his country, truly believing that without a doubt Germany could not lose this war. It was common knowledge at the time that Germany had not only one of the largest militaries, but was also the most efficient and well-funded. So destiny is all. On the domestic front, women fought another battle, exchanging their aprons for a uniform of their own, leaving their modern positions as purely homemakers to re-enter the modern workforce. A necessary change to keep several different industries and economies functioning while the men were off fighting on the battlefield. Some women entered manufacturing sectors, producing ammunition, parts for ships and aircraft to support the war effort. Others moved to the agricultural sector to assist in the mass production of food. and those with more formal education offer their services as doctors or nurses, caring for injured veterans who returned home from the battlefield. Modern technology such as a telephone and radio also provided new positions of employment for women, such as line operators redirecting calls. For the women who could drive, the transportation sector was also an option due to an increased demand for drivers that possessed a license to operate buses and trains, quite literally steering the nation in the right direction while also taking care of the family at home. The Great War also lasted much longer than originally anticipated. After the Napoleonic Wars of 1815, the majority of 19th century Europe saw relative peace. Yes, there were conflicts like between Russia and the Ottoman Empire from 1828 to 1829, in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, but nothing on the scale of the Great War. The majority of the conflicts consisted of smaller proxy wars on colonial territory, and most were resolved relatively quickly. So where is our glory, our respect, our voices? I thought we were number one. Didn't we win? Isn't this what winning looks like? Soldiers before the war were told their professions were no longer necessary evil, like it was under feudalism, but a constant force in the modern era, as noble defenders of national interests and the private property of the bourgeoisie. No longer merely peasants and aristocratic fail-sons, but champions in the imperial struggle for economic dominance and colonial expansion. Newspapers and books would hail war generals as national heroes and boast of brave conquest with the aim of bringing national glory. Yet, when these soldiers returned, most of them found their respective nations worse off than before the war. And to make things even worse, neither soldier nor civilian was prepared for a second battle and the aftershocks that came with the Spanish flu of 1918. One of the most severe pandemics in modern history, this H1N1 virus was first observed in Europe before spreading all around the world, claiming the lives of between 20 and 50 million, a third of the world's population, in the span of only 4 months. What was exceptionally unique about this pandemic is that most of the people who died were young and healthy, typically aged between 20 and 40. So if you survived the horrors of the battlefield, you still had a chance of getting taken out by a deadly virus. Medical research at the time had not yet discovered how viruses were spread, and so safety precautions weren't properly administered amongst the public. Unfortunately, antibiotics weren't invented to fight infections for another 10 years, and flu vaccines until 1949, resulting in such a high death rate. The Spanish flu also heavily affected the economy, resulting in a 6.2% decline in GDP, resulting in a spike of unemployment in various parts of the world. In modern times, was almost directly comparable to that of the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. The future for many looked bleak, as disillusioned youth felt the strain of the post-war environment almost as intensely as returned war veterans. This led some to become skeptical of the more progressive views and dreams of a socialist utopia being promoted by members of the ever-growing left. Before the Great War, citizens of their respective nations saw the future with bright eyes, carrying with them the promise of a golden age in the modern era, championed by industrial capitalism. Yet, as rival nations fought for their place under the sun, like Icarus, many flew a little too close, and like wings made of wax saw their empires melt away. Others who saw bright times now lived under an endless eclipse, shadowed with doubt and uncertainty for the future. Change within society was at times uncomfortable, but entirely unavoidable. Many struggled to adapt as empires, both ancient and established, were brought to their knees by the consequences of essentially picking the wrong side.
Movements that called themselves fascist or that deliberately modeled themselves on Mussolini existed in every Western country after World War I, and in some cases outside the Western world.
When all was said and done, no one truly won the war, as both sides experienced an unprecedented amount of casualties, alongside a major blow to national economy. One small political reward to the general public came with the gift of democracy, where every man, and sometime after women, got the chance to vote. After all, both men and women by the millions served on the home front or died on the battlefield for their nation, so mass suffrage was the very least that could be done, but resulted in a huge shock to the political system. You see, before the Great War, the peasants weren't allowed to partake in politics. The ruling elites on both ends of the political spectrum preferred to keep the business of ruling nations amongst themselves, the educated few deemed knowledgeable enough to make the appropriate decisions for the masses. The opinion of the peasants never truly had to be considered, and if they revolted, you just send in the military and mow them down. Once mass politics came into play, for the first time politicians had a whole new range of citizens to appeal to, ones that couldn't be ignored if they wished to maintain their own power. The conservatives, those on the right side of the political spectrum, found themselves in a particularly difficult conundrum when it came to appealing to this new base of voters, especially when faced with the growing, passionate left-wing party of workers.
Look back over the past with its changing empires that rose and fell, and you can foresee the future too.
So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ironically enough kicked off this conflict by declaring war on Serbia, was also the first to dissolve their empire. It was formed in the year 1867, only about 50 years before the end of World War I, and this once vast empire possessed a diverse range of cultures, ethnic groups, and languages, 11 in total. The empire was also uniquely ran by a dual monarchy, whose emperor was also the king of Hungary and Austria. Before the war, Austria-Hungary was the largest political entity and occupied or claimed most of Central Europe, with an economic growth to rival that of Germany. Having industrialized in the 1800s, the empire added several more modern institutions such as banking, manufacturing, and industry that kept both Austria and Hungary economically intertwined. After the war, the empire was split back into two independent nations at the signing of the Treaty of Trianon. This in turn reduced the population of Austria from 30 million to a mere 6 million, including 3 million Germans, most of which ended up in the newly created Czechoslovakia or in Romania. Hungary, which, under the empire, received esteemed status, suffered the most territorial losses, at around 70%, including 2/3 of its population. Like Germany and Austria, Hungary also saw the rise of fascism. Though Hungarian fascism never acquired full power within the government, the Eurocross Party was a genuine fascist movement that gained momentum within the fractured nation. Unique in their own respect, the Eurocross Party promoted the idea that their distinct mixture of races had fused into a new super race, referred to as the Magyars, a distinct Hungarian form of ultra-nationalism. The Treaty of Versailles was an additional devastating blow to German morale, as few across the board were truly pleased with the results. Germany was stripped of 13% of its territory and 10% of the total population as territories were exchanged and borders were redrawn. As a result, approximately 6 million ethnic Germans found themselves members of a different nation despite previously being a part of Germany. Germany was also forced to surrender their territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, along with effectively being told not to unify with Austria. Their military was reduced to a mere 100,000, and they were excluded from the League of Nations, a predecessor of what is now the United Nations. On top of all of this, they were forced to take the blame for the war, and pay war reparations to the Allies. Many, especially in England and France, feared the rearmament of Germany and effectively wanted to handicap them as much as possible. Unsurprisingly, those within Germany were less than thrilled with the arrangement, and many publicly condemned it, begging for politicians not to sign the treaty as it would surely doom the nation. All the same, their pleas went unheard, and the treaty was accepted by the government. Many citizens, especially those amongst right-wing and ultra-nationalist groups, felt betrayed by politicians that felt that they had sold them out. As expected, the German economy went into steep decline as civil unrest increased. This in turn allowed for several new political parties to rise within Germany, most notably the Socialists and the Fascists. The Ottoman Empire was also another participant in the Great War, making the very unfortunate decision of siding with Germany, deeming them another official loser of both the war and their once coveted empire. Despite the armistice of October 1918 ending the fighting between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies, the government led by then Enver Pasha had collapsed, and the general region was in desperate need of stability. By the 20th century, Turkish, Arab, and Armenian nationalism was on the rise as ethnic and religious tensions erupted into violence. During the Balkan Wars, noteworthy for the horrific ethnic cleansing which took place between 1912 and 1913, the Ottoman Empire lost nearly all of its territories in Europe. In 1918, the British also took control of Palestine after signing the Balfour Declaration during the Great War in 1917, announcing its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Ottoman Empire officially ended in 1922 when the title of the Ottoman Sultan was eliminated. It was then that Mustafa Kemal, or more famously known as Kemal Ataturk, rose as leader after the assembly declared Turkey to be a republic in 1923. Ataturk aspired to transform Turkey into a modern nation and ushered in sweeping reforms under his brand of nationalism called Kemalism. His principles, or fundamentals called Six Arrows, are republicanism, populism, secularism, reformism, nationalism, and statism. This included abolishing the caliphate in place of a secular society, giving women the right to vote and hold public office, and establishing a new legal system based on European law. He also sort of set a style of dress code for the Turkish people and required government workers to wear more Western-style suits while banning more traditional Turkish clothing. And while Turkey did not immediately see the rise of fascism after the Great War, the Grey Wolves, a far-right fascist organization, adhered to an extreme form of Turkish nationalism that did arise in the modern era. Similar to its more distant European relatives, the Russian Empire was also abolished, but instead of simply breaking off into smaller nations like that of Austria or Turkey, the Russians went in a slightly different direction. In February of 1917, a year before the end of World War I, Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate his once blessed throne, only to be replaced by a temporary committee of the State Duma. Not even 8 months later, in October of 1917, the Duma was overthrown by the Bolshevik Socialist Party led by Vladimir Lenin. 5 months later in March, they ended Russia's participation in the war, but not without surrendering to Germany, Finland, parts of Poland, Estonia, Livonia, part of Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Bessarabia, along with giving away part of the land to Turkey, approximately 30% of their land in total. Peace in the then USSR was a long road ahead, as in typical leftist fashion, vicious infighting was certain. One key example of pre-Soviet fascism in Russia is found with the Black Hundreds. This group would best be described as radical, conservative, ultra-nationalist reactionaries who fiercely supported the ruling family, the Romanovs. Common amongst fascist movements, the Black Hundreds were xenophobic and participated in anti-Semitic pogroms, directly inspiring later fascist movements.
How can you frighten a man whose hunger is not only in his own cramped stomach, but in the wretched bellies of his children? You can't scare him. He has known a fear beyond every other.
The Great Depression began after the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in October of 1929 and lasted until 1939, sending millions across the world into abject poverty. The crash decimated both private and corporate wealth, resulting in much prosperous investors to lose their savings, while numerous businesses downsized or shut down altogether, prompting many workers to lose their jobs. This specific Great Depression lasted 4 years longer than the previous Great Depression of the 1880s that heavily impacted England and France. It was the most severe economic depression of the modern age. And while most countries were affected by the economic collapse, the nations that were the most indebted to the United States from the post-World War I reparations were the most affected. Unsurprisingly, Germany experienced the most devastating impact of the Great Depression, as the US government refused to forgive Germany's debt. The United States wasn't left unscathed, as the crash also represented both an end to an era characterized by blind faith in American exceptionalism and the beginning of one which citizens began to question long-held American values. Germany had been forced to pay war reparations for the victors of World War I, well beyond their ability to reasonably pay back. As a result, from 1921 to 1923, the German economy experienced extreme inflation. For a time, things started to improve, only to have the problem exacerbated with the onset of the Great Depression, and by 1932, unemployment rose to nearly 5.6 million out of 60 million. That's 25% of the population. The agricultural sector also faced a growing crisis, as many were becoming unable to afford their farms. Already in competition with foreign producers with dwindling prices in the 1920s, the economic crash left farmers with an unforeseeable future. Many became consumed by debt and fell into foreclosure, having to abandon their livelihoods and sell their farms over to banks for repayment. This demographic of farmers is also where the Nazi Party received the majority of its early support.
The German fascist movement had failed to establish itself during the first post-war crisis of 1918 to 23. The next opportunity arrived with the Depression. Having done very poorly with an urban strategy in the elections of 1924 and 1928, the Nazi Party turned to the farmers. They chose well. Agriculture had prospered nowhere in the 1920s because world markets were flooded by new producers in the United States, Argentina, Canada, and Australia. Agricultural prices tumbled further in the late 1920s, even before the 1929 crash. That was only the final blow to the world's farmers.
And by playing to the sentiments, resentments, and fears of ordinary Germans, the Nazis were able to fan the flames of conflict, allowing for them to eventually take hold. The Weimar Republic found themselves unable to shake national humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles. As unemployment spiraled out of control, so did homelessness, poverty, and desperation, leaving people isolated and unable to feed their families. Many Germans turned to crime and prostitution to support themselves due to a lack of options. Just to be clear, there wasn't as if there was a shortage of food. Quite the contrary, there was plenty of food available in stores. Many just simply found themselves without the means to pay for it. Thousands of children also suffered from malnutrition and other hunger-related diseases, roaming the streets in tattered clothing. And those middle-class industrial laborers who were once well-paid lost everything, and those in more professional and managerial careers also faced the effects of the Great Depression. It was also during this time that more and more citizens began to look for alternative solutions to improve their dire circumstances, prompting an increased interest in Marxism, as many looked towards the then Soviet Union for a more allegedly humane society. The rise of socialism also gave many a sense of belonging, despite the turmoil of the interwar period. Kindred spirits are part of an international movement that was meant to change history in favor of the workers instead of the ruling elites, a goal not even medieval peasants were able to successfully acquire despite numerous attempts. Across both Europe and the United States, class struggle increased at a rapid pace as many workers began to organize and take to the streets in an effort to fight for their rights. Unsurprisingly, many were faced with brutal crackdown by the police in an effort to suppress the socialist movement and beat the working classes back into submission at the behest of the capitalist ruling classes. Nonetheless, the government's response to the crisis was ineffective, as neither side could figure out how to solve the ailments that plagued society. The conservative elites refused to work with the rapidly growing Socialist Party and felt threatened by their existence in the government, preferring to hold on to power instead. And instead of increasing jobs and easing material conditions for the lower classes, the government did quite the opposite and only exacerbated its effects. Anger and cynicism were at an all-time high, especially in German history, leaving many with little faith in traditional parties to solve their material needs. People were desperate for a miracle, a strong man, a Caesar, a third position, anything to restore stability to society, while the bourgeoisie simply wanted to maintain law and order. While it's true that for the past decade, these fascist parties constantly fanned the flames of discord, pouring gasoline on a fire struggling to extinguish itself, it was ultimately the Great Depression that created the perfect storm for the Nazi Party to gain power. So when you take a look at the German election records between 1930 to 1933, we can see that the Nazi Party went from only 18% minority government in September of 1930 to a huge leap at 37% in July of 1932. They then lost some momentum 4 months later to 33% before reaching 43% in March of 1933. For a moment, it seemed as if the Nazi Party was losing momentum. The grassroots funding they had made began to run dry, and infighting was on the rise. If it wasn't for opportunistic politicians who wished to utilize this movement for their own agenda, it might have actually burned out. The rise of fascism never happens as a result of a single event or situation, but when democracy has been brought to its knees by a hurricane of conditions, both external and internal, in the eye of the storm, the nation will be reborn, from the ashes it will rise, or so the fascists claim. So what is fascism, and why do people seem to be unable to define it? The very problem with trying to define fascism is, at its surface, fascism appears to be contradictory as it isn't rigidly defined as other political ideologies. Liberalism, conservatism, socialism, authoritarianism, and democracy all have well-defined and established doctrines or mandates. Fascism is A, but not A. Fascism, by its ultra-nationalist nature, is more shapeless and less specifically defined. It takes on unique characteristics for each nation or group in which it exists, based on local cultural traditions, to solidify a distinct, unique national identity for its people. However, fascism still does maintain a set of core principles, which we explore in a later video. One problem with accurately defining and analyzing fascism is that all fascist movements neither look the same nor adhere to a strict set of principles. There isn't such thing as a fascist manifesto that outlines tried and tested methods to organize society. It's quite literally feelings over facts. Most fascist movements tend to be so reactionary that any proposed plan falls apart under the chaotic speed at which changes are attempted, leaving fascist leaders too often to kind of just wing it. So this is where we will finally come to our definition of fascism, one we will be using for the rest of these videos when we discuss the topic moving forward. It comes from political scientist and professor at Oxford, Roger Griffin, who also wrote The Nature of Fascism. He defines fascism with an ideal type, the fascist minimum, the lowest common denominator that all fascist movements possess. According to Griffin, fascism is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism.
It boils down to the assertion that fascism is best defined as a revolutionary form of nationalism, one which sets out to be a political, social, and ethical revolution, welding the people into a dynamic national community under new elites infused with new heroic values. The core myth which inspires this project is that only a populist, trans-class movement of purifying, cathartic national rebirth, palingenesis, can stem the tide of decadence. Griffin then goes on to explain that the fascist mentality is characterized by the sense of living through an imminent turning point in contemporary history, when the dominance of the allegedly bankrupt or degenerate forces of conservatism, individualistic liberalism, and materialist socialism is finally to give way to a new era in which feudalistic nationalism will triumph.
The term palingenesis derives from palin, which means again or anew, and genesis, which means creation or birth, and it refers to a sense of a new start or a generation after a phase of crisis or decline. And different than reincarnation, which is the transmigration of souls after destruction of a corporeal form, palingenesis revolves remaking the physical form with the fragments that remain. Similar to the story around the phoenix, a mythical bird which will cyclically self-destruct and then explode with fiery brilliance, only to regenerate itself from the ashes that remain of its past incarnation. The palingenic idea of rebirth entails a nostalgic conception of a better and more harmonious past, a paradise on earth that will be returned by the new political order. The palingenetic myth follows a three-phase pattern in which 1. The nation's earlier virtue, peace, and well-being are 2. Threatened or destroyed by decay, crisis, and an outside threat, and 3. The nation is saved, usually by a charismatic leader. One of the clearest examples of a palingenetic myth comes with that of general religion. In the Christian Bible, we see both the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, an essential and central myth around all of Christianity, where a savior or chosen one was reborn 3 days after being executed by his rivals, transforming him into a pure being of light, ascending to a higher plane, the heavens, forgiving humanity of all of their sinful ways. The same myth also affects the present day. According to the New Testament, this element of palingenesis also appears, but in the sense of the spiritual regeneration associated with apocalyptic visions of the end time, when a new heaven and new earth will replace the present creation. And many in the present also believe that the increasingly apocalyptic situations that we are facing are, in fact, a good thing, because it means that the Savior is returning to cleanse the world of sin, decadence, and liberal degeneracy. In Nazi Germany, Hitler took on the image of a prophet and was fixated on mysticism and the occult. It was known he had an obsession with ancient artifacts, and his team made several pilgrimages to holy sites and was even rumored to have found the Spear of Destiny, the exact weapon that pierced the side of Jesus Christ. However, they weren't the only ones to do this, most notably Mussolini and his obsession with the ancient Roman Empire. In a more modern circumstance, Donald Trump has a heavy religious backing behind him, where many Christian talking heads claim that he is divine, ordained, chosen by God. To go a step further, his entire motto, "Make America Great Again" and "Drain the Swamp," are examples of a palingenetic myth aimed to purify the nation of its perceived liberal decadence.
Palingenetic myth, combined with religious and apocalyptic elements, is thus a powerful means of constructing identities and mobilizing fear.
Griffin also emphasizes the concept of rebirth doesn't always refer to imperial conquest of foreign nations to secure land for its people. One of the most common examples of this could be found in the Nazis' concept of Lebensraum, or settler colonialism, or Mussolini's imperial conquest in North Africa to ascend a higher potential and rule or dominate over other nations. A national rebirth could also happen exclusively on a domestic or neutralist level, or they could work in tandem with other nations in a common cause of regeneration, kindred spirit, so to speak, universalist. One thing worth emphasizing is that palingenesis is not restricted to fascism, only its ultra-nationalist form. An extreme or radical devotion to a nation, to an often level xenophobia, and as far as to support more totalitarian measures to maintain supremacy, a complete rejection of liberal institution. And while it's true you can see elements of totalitarianism in other political ideologies and regimes, fascism always requires an element of this.
Now the concept of ultranationalism. It tends to be associated with the concept of the nation as a higher, racial, historical, spiritual, or organic reality which embraces all the members of the ethical community who belong to it.
A key example of this comes with the more unique brand of ultranationalism that was reflected in the Nazi Party of Germany.
Griffin states that due to the mythical component of history used to create an artificial sense of identity, blood purity is often one of these factors. An obsession with racial history and eugenics merely indicates that a particular variety of ultranationalism is at work rather than its contradiction.
Not all fascist movements have to have a strong rooting in concepts of biological or racial supremacy, but ultranationalism always trends towards racism through their fixation on national and cultural supremacy. Not all fascist movements progress the same way or meet the same level of success. Robert Paxton, historian, political scientist, and author of the book The Anatomy of Fascism, also outlines a progression of fascist movements through the 5 stages as follows. 1. The creation of fascist movements. 2. The rooting as parties in a political system. 3. The acquisition of power. 4. The exercise of power. And finally, in the long term, 5. Radicalization or entropy. A movement doesn't have to reach full-blown state-sanctioned murder your enemies in open street and celebrate the violence for it to be a true fascist movement. Since the Great War, or World War I, all modern nations have had some sort of fascist movement, but most of them never reached stage 2, with only 2 of which, Italy and Germany, reaching stage 5. Although there were many fascist movements around Europe and the Americas, only Nazi Germany, so far, went as extreme as to attempt an extermination on a perceived outgroup while enslaving another outgroup to build a racially superior empire. Other fascist regimes have attempted to do so in their own capacity, but they were unable to pass effectively through stage 4 into the stage of radicalization.